Daniel, el auditorio es tuyo.
Gracias. Gracias, joven. Buenas tardes. Gracias, Jorge. Cuidado. Yo prefiero hablar en inglés, por favor. This is a great honor for me, and before I start, I do want to thank everyone involved in this. This was quite a great idea, and it started with 2015 in Daniel Oropesa in Potosi, which I attended gladly, and I am very happy to be a part of this one as well. I think Andres Cortázar has done a wonderful job, and I know he's received a lot of rounds of applause already, but please, for Andres, thank you for putting this together. So I want to start with the people that inspired me for this. I'm honored to follow a long collaboration that my father, Dr. Frank Sedwick, and his good friend and client, Joseph Lasser, had. They're both deceased now. They both shared a particular love for Colombian gold cobs. Lasser's further collaboration with Dr. Jorge Emilio Restrepo brought us the most complete reference catalog possible in Jorge's renowned book, Coins of Colombia, which was published in English in 2012. So it is only with humble deference to that author that I feel comfortable presenting this to you today as an expanded treatment with a lot of additions and changes. And I do want to emphasize that things change all the time, as Carol had mentioned in her talk, to the extent that this, what you see today, supersedes what you see on the disc that came with your your backpacks. I had to revise quite a few things, and you will see it here today. And the reason is Colombian cobs are challenging and often miscatalogued. Not only are the origins and histories of Colombia's first mints complex, but also the coins themselves are very difficult to decipher. They're struck on crudely shaped planchets, irregular flans, and the strikes themselves weren't very good. The gold cobs are particularly daunting because the basic design of shield on obverse and cross on reverse, it was an arrangement that did not change for the entire period that the coins were minted, 1622 to 1756, relegated to the peripheries all the important data like dates, mint marks, and assayers. So all you have on a lot of coins is just the shield and the cross. Now, my hope is that this presentation will show you how to utilize differences in the shields and crosses, the central designs, to attribute the many coins that lack the visible peripheral data, and we shall be able to reattribute coins whose dates or other data were miscatalogued over the years. Fortunately, unlike some other mints that I study, much contemporary documentation exists to support and augment the dye research and enable more accurate attributions. The works of Antonio Barriga Villalba, to start with, and then Jorge Proctor in our day, have provided and analyzed most of the important documentary data, particularly the mint records themselves. So any reference here to assayer tenures or mint operations is thanks to the work of these great researchers. The die detail data I present here are generally my own, however, with a few exceptions. But I would also like to acknowledge the efforts of other hands-on researchers and collectors like Herman Blanton, Jorge Becerra, Kent Ponterio, and several others. And then finally, at the risk of some immodesty, I would also like to acknowledge what I call the unsung heroes in this project, which are the various auction houses whose conscientious cataloging, with, of course, inevitable errors, and state-of-the-art photography and current technology make it possible for us to find and trace and keep track of the coins that we study now. In particular, I point out Ponterio stacks Bauer, Towers, Audio and Calico, Heritage, and then, of course, my own company, Sedwick, Daniel Frank Sedwick LLC. Generally speaking, at least in terms of Colombian cobs, there is no other way to get collections published. Obviously, a collector could publish his own collection, but that's really rare. What happens is they go to auction, and then all of a sudden we have the data. We have the photos, and we have the information. Unfortunately, this is a world where dedicated museums are still too few and isolated and underfunded and understaffed. I'm sure any museum would tell you. So I feel that the commercial sector has come to the rescue on this. So here's a little background. There's a lot to read there, so hopefully you can read while you listen. Unlike the other large colonial mints in Mexico and Peru, which struck silver coins for decades before finally issuing gold, the region now known as Colombia minted gold cobs from essentially the beginning. In fact, some coins were designed and dated before the Colombian mints opened. The genesis of Colombian coinage was in 1614, when the region of the New Kingdom of Granada, Nuevo Reino de Granada, hereafter I will refer to it as just Nuevo Reino, first petitioned the crown for minting rights. By the time permission was granted in 1619, a new mint had just begun operation in the city of Madrid in Spain, which opened in 1615, and was chosen to craft the first dies to be sent to Nuevo Reino. Curiously, these dies all bore a mint mark of SF for Santa Fe de Bogotá, without any assayer letter, because the office of assayer in Nuevo Reino had not yet been assigned. That is the first mint mark we have there on the left. Whether they were meant to be patterns only, these first coins, is still unknown, and the very few extant coins struck from these dies, in fact, may have just been samples to send back to Spain, as nearly all of them were recovered from the remains of the 1622 fleet, the Atocha and Santa Margarita particularly. Whatever their purpose, these coins, which were dated 1619, the date they were engraved in Spain, and 1622, were struck at the Bogotá Mint in 1622 in the name of Philip III. And these comprise the first gold coins struck in Colombia, and as was revealed when the Atocha came and these coins hit the market, they're in fact the very first gold coins made in the entire New World. But Bogotá, of course, was not the only mint in Colombia. As we know, a minting operation took place right here in Cartagena de Indias. And in fact, as Jorge pointed out, it started just before Bogotá did, in the year 1621. After that date, the Cartagena Mint worked concurrently with Bogotá, but only in the years 1625 to 1635, and then later in 1655, just briefly. Bogotá began striking cobs in 1627 and did not cease until 1756. Confusingly, both mints used the mint mark NR and RN, or RN, for Nuevo Reino until 1630, again, as Jorge just pointed out. As mentioned already, without peripheral details, you must learn the styles of the interior designs just to determine which mint even struck the given coin. A corpus of clear examples enables us to determine exact dates, or at least ranges of dates, and these gold cobs fall into what I present here as six distinct series of coins, which are based on substantial design changes, and where I can, I've split those into types and varieties, which you'll see. One thing I want to point out is in this discussion, wherever I don't state specifically, I'm talking about the two escudos denomination, which was by far the dominant denomination in gold. And also, as you'll see on the screen, when I use just the letter E, capital E, that stands for escudos. All the dates that are listed in what you'll see here are just the ones known so far. There certainly could be more added later as other specimens come to light or are confirmed. Now, the most obvious way to attribute the date of a coin is seeing the date, right? Well, it's not always the case. Since the date on Colombian gold cobs is in the peripheral legend, as we've mentioned, only coins made on broad enough flans with adequate centering will show the date. And even then, it is usually just the very bottom parts of the digits. So the problem is that a curved digit bottom could be a 0, a 6, or an 8. And a digit with a rounded tail could be a 3, or a 5, or a 9. And then a vertical or tilted line could be a 1 or 4 or a 7. If you add all that up, by the way, the only digit that's clear is a 2. It has a flat base. So that leads to a lot of incorrect attributions. And as I went through this research, I probably found as many misattributed coins as properly attributed coins. And again, the difference is following the details, knowing what the shields and the crosses look like, knowing the assayers, all of the interior data. So I will start to describe those two features, but I do want to mention, again, in the peripheral legend, there are other things, not just the date. The king's name, for example, and his ordinal usually is only partially visible, but sometimes it's not visible at all. And there is no diagnostic change in style from Philip IV, when it started, to Charles II, and then from Philip V to Louis I. So it's very helpful to observe parts of the king's name in the legend. You need to know what all the letters are for the king's name when you can. So then working inward, on the flanks of the shields, to the left of the, or right of the shield, you see mint marks, assayers, and denominations. Now, these elements are normally at least partially visible, but rarely do you see them 100% complete. Sometimes one of the letters of the 2-letter mint mark is the same as the assayer mark. That doesn't help either. And then you have other assayers that are multiple letters. Then last, and actually the most important thing, as I've mentioned, are the central elements themselves, the shield and the cross, which includes the quadrilobe or orlas around the cross. So recognizing differences in these elements, that's the best and most reliable way to attribute a Colombian gold cob. I just wanted to point out here, you can see the names of all the various elements in the shield. That'll be very important later. You have the list of the kings here and the mint marks here. But what I wanted to point out most of all on this slide is that this on the left is a very nice cob that actually does show you the mint mark and assayer, the denomination, and some of the date. But this is the typical gold cob. This is what you normally see from a Colombian gold cob. You have only the shield, only the cross, some of the treasure, practically nothing in the legend, no date, no king's name. Makes it very difficult. So, moving on, now I show you the assayers. For Cartagena, there's just one when it comes to gold cobs. You have Juan de la Era, whose letter is E. And then for Bogota, you have a much larger range of dates, obviously, so you can see the names and the dates listed there. I don't really want to enumerate all of them and talk about each of them at this point, but I do want to point out a few that are problematic or difficult. You see, I have listed, I have listed here PAR, and this one here, believe it or not, that is supposed to be RG. This is to the right of the shield, and there are some better examples, but this is the kind of thing that you have to decipher. It is a known assayer for the date, and you can barely see an R, you can barely see the curve of a G, but based on the date, it has to be that. This is OP, and you see that it ran into the top of the bottom of the denomination. That makes it even more difficult, and some might read that as a GP. Sometimes you see GP listed. This is just the G. This is another one I wanted to point out. This is SM. I read that as an S above an M, and the problem is that in the silver coins, it looks more like an I, the monogram that's on the silver coins. And the assayer's name was Jose Marti. Well, my theory is that his name was not Marti. They just used shorthand. It was Martinez. And when they made the initial on the coin, the gold coins, they put an S above the M. On the silver coin, it's not clear. It's owned, I believe it's owned by the Banco de la República. It's in a museum. But on the gold coin, and there are plenty of these. It's not that there's only one known. They definitely show an S over an M. This here is an A over G over assayers, or another important set of data that we can use. You'll see this is very interesting as we get into it. This assayer Arce, Buenaventura de Arce, had all kinds of ways to spell his name or render his name. This is, at some point, he did actually put A-R-C-E as his name. But you notice, if you see this little cutout, it's not to the right of the shield where an assayer would normally be, or to the left. This is actually in the legend. We'll get to that later, but he made a point to put his names in the legend, or whatever he used. Sometimes it was just V.A., which is a little strange, because that's Ventura de Arce, and his first name was Buenaventura. And then one of the more amusing things is that he used A-R-S-E, which is a British term for rear end. But that one is usually rendered with a numeral 8 instead of an S, but a lot of strange things. And then the others, they're later dates, we can get into those. So let's start with the series. Now, remember I said there are 6 series. This is the first one. Is actually a fairly simple series because there are only 2 coins. It's a small group. It consists of coins struck from dies manufactured in Spain. And because so few are known, and because almost all of them were salvaged from the 1622 fleet, or all, I'm not sure. It could be all, but there's at least one that was rumored not to have come from there. It is believed they were samples, just samples. And Jorge Proctor recently showed that they were struck in Bogota and not Cartagena. Sometimes you'll see them attributed to Cartagena. But they were actually struck in Bogota in 1622. And then after these issues, nothing was struck at either mint, Bogota or Cartagena, until 1625. The 2 escudos that you see on the left here, there are only 8 known of those. They all have names. Various researchers have given them names based on their owners over the years. And then the 1 escudo on the right, there are only 2 known. They're both of all of them are of the same design. The 1 escudos, I believe, I remember seeing one from the Atocha years ago, but I don't know where the other one is. So that's a very simple series. Cartagena, Series 2, is also somewhat simple. You have, it starts with coins that were modified from the first series that we saw. They were locally made dies, but they were modified. And that was in December of 1625 and then 26, using those modified 1622 dies. Remember, those were made in Bogota, so somehow they got to Cartagena and were modified. But you see, as the mint mark on the right of the shield is NR above the assayer E. Now, following that, they did somewhat a prolific run from 1627 to 1635, using the same assayer E, Juan de la Era, using the mint mark RN until 1630, when the mint mark was changed to C. Now, you could spend a collecting lifetime gathering up all the different variations of dots and crosses within and outside the cross, or the treasure around the cross, and combined with the placement of the mint mark, right or left, and the assayer on either side. And I'll get into the varieties, but it is not anywhere near as simple as it is in Restrepo. He lists just a few varieties, but I found quite a bit more. Then the Cartagena mint closed in 1635, and there was no gold made there after that. So I have 2 types listed here, type A and type B. The type A has a small cross, small fleurs inside the cross, the quadrants of the cross. It has mint mark NR and assayer E to the right, and that was 1625 and 26, as I said, made from local modified dies. Then type B, which has RNE to the right instead of NR, you can see that as an R above an N. Nobody knows, by the way, why they switched from NR to RN. That went from 1627 to 1635, and had a more normal cross, a larger cross with bigger fleur-de-lis, as you could see there. And as I said, there's several varieties. When I get to the next slide, you'll see there are even more varieties. But for this particular type, there are only 3 that we know of now. One with dots inside and crosses outside the treasure, which was 1627 and 29. And then crosses inside and outside the treasure, 1628. Crosses inside, dots outside for 1628. Type C has the same type of cross and fleurs, but now we have, as I said, mint mark C above the assayer E, and that's to the right, with the dates listed 1635 or 30 to 35. For this type, I found 5 different varieties. Again, this is having to do with the dots inside or outside the treasure, crosses. Maybe the mint mark is below the assayer, or there's a difference in the denomination, that type of thing. So hopefully you can read all the different varieties that are there. One thing that's interesting is that in 1634, we have some with the assayer E in retrograde. Like you see down here on the left, the E is backwards. There is also a variety here where the denomination is presented upright. Usually the denomination is like this, where it reads vertically, and this denomination reads horizontally. And they even made a mistake where they used just a Roman numeral 1 instead of a Roman numeral 2. There's also an interesting, did I show this one? Well, this is an interesting variety because these are florets. They're not crosses. They're not little plus signs that you see here normally. They're actual 4-leaf flowers. And then there are some that have, you can see this one here has pluses in the dimples. I call these treasure dimples, whereas this one has ringlets in the treasure dimples. So now let's move on to Series 3. We're back to the Bogota Mint, which is where we will remain for the rest of the discussion. And this ranges all the way from 1627 to 1692. The characteristic of this series is that they use the mint mark NR. This was the first regular production of gold cobs from the Bogota Mint and the commencement of presumably an unbroken run of nearly 130 years of gold cob minting. This series comprises coins with mint mark NR combined with an assayer mark on the shield side with crosses that show fleur-de-lis inside the quadrants and full ringlets in the dimples of the treasures. Remember on the Cartagena I showed you some had plus signs or crosses. These are actually ringlets on all the examples. It begins with a 1627 to 1628 type with coins whose cross sides resemble the 1622 pieces, but with a larger shield flanked by mint mark NR and assayer P, and a denomination 2, but in an Arabic 2, not a Roman numeral 2. And then in 1629, we have a new cross with thinner arms and tiny fleurs, and the mint mark was changed to RN. Here we have the same thing that we saw in Cartagena, where they switched from NR to RN. And then after Assayer Pinto's death in 1632, we see he takes this coin, which is this coin here. He takes this as a basis for proving annunciae issues during the tenure of Pinto, and it just wasn't the case. As Jorge Proctor has found out, annunciae can be proven not to have been there in 1628. So he was using old dies to make coins with his initial. It wasn't as important to them being exact. The more important thing was that you had dies and you had planchets, so you struck coins. And then the date 1635 this is where we start to get into treasure, which is obviously my other half of expertise. And in 1635, that's when we see lots and lots of examples because of what's known as the Misuno hoard, which was deposited around 1636 in a place called Misuno near Honda, Colombia, in the Magdalena River. There were also many examples dated 1636 from the Misuno hoard, and they have distinctive ringlets that distinguish themselves from the, I'll show that on the next slide. Right. So then you'll see that the mint mark and assayer placement can vary as late as 1655. And going that late, we also see more treasure coins from the Maravillas shipwreck. There are hundreds of coins dated 1654 known from the Maravillas shipwreck, which sank in 1656 in the Bahamas. Then the last issues of this series in 1670s through 1690s are characterized by small dashes that extend from the ends of the cross to the treasure. So they're a bit distinctive. But as we'll see, those are among the very hardest coins to attribute. They're very crude, and dates are very difficult to find. So the types that we have under here, there will be quite a few, but for this page, we are just looking at types A through E. And hopefully you've had a chance to read through the data that distinguish each of these types, because I don't want to spend too much time on that. But again, it has to do with the types of cross. You can see that the initial crosses were very thin, and the fleur-de-lis and the quadrants were very small, which you see on all of these examples. Then on the mule coin, the cross was a bit smaller, but you still have these little ringlets and the little fleur-de-lis. And then in 1633, it's hard to tell because this is double struck, but you still have the same type of cross, but it's evolving. And when you get to these coins, this is where the Masuno hoard comes in. You can see the cross is already bigger, and the fleur-de-lis are noticeably bigger. And that continues throughout this period here, which goes into the maravillas, into the 1650s. But we'll also get into these types as well. These are the types that run from 1635 to 1665. And also, this is under Philip IV, by the way. We've stayed on Philip IV, but this series will continue into the next king. One thing I want to point out under these varieties, I've listed 7 varieties under this type, type F. Because this whole page is type F. I want to point out that in the first variety, which ran from 1635 to 1642, we have some variations. This coin up here is dated 1639, but you notice that right outside the arms of the cross are dots. And then in the dimples of the treasure dimples, you have some dots also. This is characteristic only of the date 1639. So if you see something with NRA and dots, you know it's that date. Another one that I want to point out, I did mention before, is 1636, where you have dots right here in those rings. You notice 1635 doesn't have that. This is a 1635 coin on the left, empty ringlets. Dots are in this one. Now, you have other varieties as you go down the line. The other one I wanted to point out, let me see which one it was here. Well, I can't find which one it was that I was going to point out on here. But I do want to point out that there was a change of assayer. So you see in the varieties I've listed here, I don't show it, but the last of the assayer A pieces, presumably 1642, was superseded by assayer R in 1642. Now the problem with this one, and why it's all kind of unknown, is that there was a mistake that was made many years ago. This is a bit of an aside, but if you look in Calico and look in Lasser, Restrepo, all of them, you'll see that there's a coin that was referred to as NR mint mark over R assayer to left. But if you look at it very carefully, you look at all the different photos, and Restrepo's photos are not clear enough to see this. There's a little bit of double striking there. And what you are actually seeing is NR with the R doubled. And you can't see the A because it's obliterated by the double striking. So that was one of the problems in 1642. It was a 1642 coin. But the other problem is that in Restrepo you will see a note that says that the Banco de la República has coins dated as late as 1642 from the Masuno hoard. That's a mistake. The Masuno hoard was definitely no later than 1636. And if you read in Calico's Aportación, which will be in the bibliography, there was a coin dated 1642 that he mentions in passing when he's mentioning also the Masuno hoard. But if you read it carefully, he is not saying that it is from the Masuno hoard. But that was an error that was perpetuated. Now, something I also want to point out before we leave this slide, if you look at variety 6 here, I say most with proper lions and castles. This is something we're going to see repeated throughout all of these gold cobs. They never really got the hang of putting lions and castles in the right places. If you remember from the shield that I showed at the beginning, that's Leon and Castile, and it should be up here in the upper left quadrant of the shield. This coin, for example, here, this is a lion, that's a castle, that's a castle. That's incorrect. That's not the way it was supposed to be. But in this particular period, that was the norm. That will come into play later. It gets more complicated, believe it or not. So these are the type G coins within that series. And this is the Charles II type. That's the only distinction from the previous type. But of course, we have lots of changes that took place here. You can see in variety 2, you have the assayer R above the denomination, which is this coin here, and very clear 1672, by the way, so it's very diagnostic. Also, you have the king's name, C-A-R-O, for Carolus, but it's R over 2, which is an aberration. Usually you have 2 over R. Then, in the next variety, you have, this is where we start to see the spikes from the ends of the cross. So you can see right there, there's a little mark that goes from the end of the cross to the treasure. Nobody knows why that design feature was put in, but this is around when it happened. The first examples I've seen were 1675, around that time period. This coin here is actually the only one I could find a photo of that shows R over G to the right, and I certainly don't think that's a clear example at R, but I have to say there are others that are clear examples, or better anyway. And also, none has a visible date, but this is the reason why I preserve this photo, is because you can see very clearly that the penultimate digit is a 7. 1, 6, 7, and then what is that digit? We'll just assume it's a 6 because that's the only documented date for assayer RG, who is Gaspar de los Reyes. And then, as you recall, we were looking at some assayers before. Here is the OP I was talking about. And here is a true GP. It does exist, but there is an actual capital G and not just a little dot that was messed up from a double striking. So but they refer to the same assayer. Was Pedro Garcia. So next we have varieties 7 through 10. And there are a lot of interesting revelations in this variety. A few auctions back, gosh, I think auction 10 is going back quite a ways. We had a couple of these coins, and one thing that I had noticed was that this particularly beautiful coin here, dated 1687 without question, and without question this is a G here, G assayer. Notice that inside these ringlets that are in the treasure dimples, these are little crosses. Perhaps it's not so clear on here, but that is an X shape right there, another X shape there, in all the dimples. Well, we also had this coin here. Notice it has the same little X's in the treasure dimples. Here is the date. This date was misattributed to, I believe it was 1667 or something like that, but clearly it's the same die as this one here. It is 1687, and notice the assayer is not G anymore, it is S over M. Now, the one single 8 reales in silver that has the same assayer mark or modification of it was 1687. So everything matches, but that was a revision to what was believed to be prior. The only other one I want to point out here that is interesting is this coin down here. This looks like a G to me, but this here is very clearly an A over G. So we have a definite end of the tenure of assayer G, Garcia, and a definite beginning to the tenure of assayer Arce, A. And that was in 1692. So it's a nice clean transition. We can see one assayer to the next. This is also the very last issue of this type that had a mint mark, or this series that had a mint mark. The next series, there's no mint mark. I want to point out here briefly that when you see any that have this dark background, and this may be the only one that has the white paint with the number written on it, these are all photos from the State of Florida collection. You'll see quite a bit more as we go along, which is a public collection in Florida, but I had the privilege of being able to examine them and take photos to use for this. So now we come to Series 4, which I will just warn you right now is the most complex, and I believe that this is where you will see the most changes from what is in the disc that you got. So in 1693, for some unknown reason, Assayer Arce decided to remove the mint mark completely from the gold cob design, and his assayer initial disappeared as well. So my analysis of this series has changed it to 4 different distinct types for this no mint mark series. You have the Charles II lifetime issues, to borrow a term from ancient coins, but I think that it works perfectly here, which went from 1693 to the year 1700 when Charles II died. And that will have, those are the coins that have those funny assayer ARCE or ARSE in the legend. Those are the lifetime issues. Then you have the Charles II to Philip V transitional issues from 1700 to 1702. These will generally have, they may have the ARCE spelled out, but these are the ones that are distinguished by having the V.A. in the legend for the assayer's name. This, by the way, was the transitional issues were totally missed by Restrepo and other researchers. It's kind of a brand new detail in this field. Then the Charles II posthumous issues are pretty familiar. That's what you see probably the most of any Colombian gold cobs at all. Those were from 1703 to 1716. No assayer mark at all, not even in the legend. And then the last type, which seems almost unrelated, but is fundamentally related because it has no mint mark and no assayer. Those were the Philip V issues. And I will give you the way you can tell one from the other. The first 3 types that I mentioned, the lifetime issues, the transitional issues, and the posthumous issues of Charles II, these are populated by an abundance of specimens from the 1715 fleet, which is a fleet lost off the east coast of Florida. And we see these coins every day. They can be accurately identified by the changes in the shield design. It's very important to be able to tell because, for example, if you see one in an NGC slab, I think that you have about a 50-50 chance that they got it right in the date range. And it's not that they are totally without expertise, it's just very difficult. This will show you what the differences are. The 4th type, as I say, is a little bit different. It was from 1716 to 1721. That was the full Philip V issues. You rarely see the king's name, but I can show you some insights that will tell you how to identify those. So I mentioned some complexity, and here it is. This table took quite a number of days and weeks and months to put together, and I will certainly share it with anyone who has interest, but I have come up with, I believe it is 16, you'll have to count that, but I think that it's 16 different varieties of what Restrepo had 4 of. Now, there was not anything wrong with his attributions. I mean, these are the fundamental designs of shield. You have the A shield, B, C, and D. What Restrepo referred to as Arc, Arc 1, Arc 2, and Arc 3. The difference is, and the reason I've split these like this is because A and B have this dot for Granada in the bottom of the shield, and you can see that the elements are separated. You have Austria above Old Burgundy. You have two fleur-de-lis for New Burgundy. This is actually, in heraldry, should be a lion for Brabant, but here it's a cross shape. And then B is a reversal of that. So that seems pretty simple, except that you have combinations of the two, and various combinations. And that's where we get into these variants, what I call A prime D, A double prime, BX, B double prime. You can see the differences. Sometimes they are simple things like lions and castles transposed, which I say is somewhat random, but it is still a distinguishing factor. But more importantly, it has to do with whether New Burgundy or Austria or Granada, Aragon and Naples and Sicily, which is the X shape up here, whether they're on the left or right. But I have been able, with clearly dated examples, I've been able to come up with date ranges for every one of these varieties, enough to show that AB was indeed exclusively Charles II lifetime issues. C and D, on the other hand, were only known for 1700 and later. Problem is, as I said, from 1700 to 1702, you have transitional issues. So that's where everything in the middle comes in. The difference is, and I can come back to this if somebody wants to see it and take notes, but the difference is what I call the transitional shield, not to be confused with Charles II transitional, the difference is this space right here. You see, what came before was, on the left side here, you see two fleurs for New Burgundy, and on the other side, on the other side, you have the bar, the horizontal bar for Austria. But if you look over here, you will see that those two X's have a space above and a space below. However, you still have the Granada, or a dot, in the center at the bottom. So it is still a lifetime issue. This is also a lifetime issue, but this is just a B. This is not one of the transitionals with the primes and all the other little code names that I've put here. This is just a simple B. Remember, A had the Naples and Sicily to the right, B has it to the left. Notice also, here you have the full Odyssey in the legend for the assayer. I don't want to describe each and every one of these things to you, but I'm going to give you enough to go by. And as I mentioned, what you have on the disk, with all the varieties that were mentioned, I compiled that into a table instead because I found more varieties as I went along. I want to go on to the, well, before I go on, I do want to point out these are state of Florida coins here, by the way. I want to point out what I call A prime D. The D stands for dots, and that's because they must have run out of X's that day or something, because they put a dot where there should have been an X on both sides. And then I call this one BX because they ran out of dots that day and they used X's. So there is an X or a plus sign. I keep doing that, in the middle of the bottom. What should be is just a dot, and then you should have X's and the Austria. But remember, spaces above and below, that is always part of a deviation from the A and B that Restrepo had. And most of all, remember that all of these A and B shields have that Granada at the bottom. And also I'll mention that this little N escutcheon is called Flanders and Tyrol. I don't think I've ever seen anyone as clear as this. The lion and eagle of Flanders and Tyrol look just like ducks or something very crude. So now let's get into the transitional issues from 1700 to 1702. These are very complex, and I wouldn't even venture to guess or to try to attribute exact dates to exact varieties, because what we have here, not just do you have differences in the shield design, but you also have differences in how the king's name and the rest of the legend was rendered. If you can see, read through here, you have some that have Carolus to Arce, the assayer's name, and then normal legend on the reverse, followed by a date. Then he decided to put his name on the reverse side. Then he decided to put V.A. Then he decided he didn't want to put his name there at all anymore. And then, hey, look, here's Philip. That's a coin where you have Charles on the obverse and Philip on the reverse. There were two dates that had that. And then here's one that is kind of a recent revelation, is that sometimes Carolus was spelled with an O. And sometimes you have Philip struck over Carolus, and then Philip on the reverse, too. It was an utter mess. And the coins are somewhat of a mess, too. But occasionally, you will get a very instructive coin like this one, which we just sold in our last auction, that tells you enough to see that here is a VA assayer, here is a PHIL for Philippus, here is what looks like and is CAR, but with a little bit of a P over it too. This is Philippus over Carolus. Most interesting thing, of course, about this coin is that the date was punched in entirely upside down, in the correct order, but upside down. And if you were to read it from the edge inward, it says 2071 instead of 1702. These are the exact shields that I've taken spotlighted on this. Again, I'm not getting into the varieties by date. I want to show you the exact shields instead, because it was the shields that actually changed. Again, we have the spaces above and below, but notice, what are we missing here on all of these in the bottom? The Flanders and Tyrol shield here extends all the way to the bottom of the shield. Also, if you compare this coin in the middle to the one to the left, you will see that it's just X's, whereas there's a bar of Austria on the one on the left with X's here. This was a transition. When you get to the last type under this, the last type under this series, you'll see that the whole bottom half of the shield is X's. But we're not quite there yet. Interestingly enough, by the way, here's another 1702 that has the digit of the date upside down, and you can see the VA. But we don't know what this C is here. The C doesn't make any sense for Philippus 5, DG, nothing, C doesn't place into that anywhere. This is the first time that we see no blank spaces and just X's on either side. That's what's coming next. But we'll leave the transitional issues for now. This is the bulk of the coins that we see from the 1715 fleet. And they should be easily recognizable because the bottom half always has X's over X, two X's over one X on either side of a shield, and a scutcheon that goes all the way to the bottom of the shield. Of course, you'll see different varieties here based on whether Q is the code for transposed, quadrants transposed. P is for proper quadrants. In other words, the lions and castles are in the correct places, whereas here they're transposed. The regular C, which was Restrepo's ARC3 rather, has the Naples and Sicily to the right, which is the way it should be. Prior to that, the B had it on the left. Now, the only difference between C and D, fundamentally, is that D, on the bottom here, we have D with proper quadrants and D with transposed quadrants. The difference is that the Naples and Sicily X has a dot above and a dot below, see on both of these coins. And that was the last type that occurred with the last shield that occurred under this, the posthumous series. And again, I'm skipping the varieties because it's just too complicated, but the original chart that I showed you has the date ranges. So then we have the, I did want to point out, some variants that we have here because these are distinctive, and I point these out because if you see that, then you'll know what the date is. This coin here, clearly dated 1703, has dots inside the treasure dimples, the ringlets. Problem is, well, you have to be able to observe the shield, that this is shield C, this is shield D. But the cross side, 1703, has the dots. So whenever you see those dots, you know it's 1703. Not all have that, but when you see ones with the dots, you know that's the date. Down here, this is an exception because this is a one escudo. So all of the one escudos had the dots, but they have X's for the fleurs, and that's for the date 1708. So if you're just talking about 2 escudos, the dots mean 1703, and for 1 escudos it means 1708. And then in 1709, this is very strange. They went to what looks like a Mexican cross with the dots right at the ends of the cross. And that is only in the year 1709. You can see the dates here, 709. But there are others. And this is a DQ shield. So now the last type within this series, as I mentioned, is the Philip V type, the Philip V issues. And they look a bit different. Fundamentally, it's the same shield, but you have a more complete Naples and Sicily with the eagles, as they should be, instead of just dots, and more vertical lines as well. This is a very clearly dated example, 1720. Notice it has the dots and the dimple rings that I had mentioned for 1703. You have to know the difference between a Philip V and a Charles II posthumous before you can make a determination that those dots are 1703 or later. This shield is quite a bit different. Even though it's fundamentally the same, this Naples and Sicily is very distinct from what we saw before. Also, you don't have lines between the X's and other differences, minor differences. Also, I wanted to point out that this was a period in which we don't have a lot of coins to go by. So it's probably 20 or 30 different partially dated or undated coins that kind of assembled this the list here. I was able to come up with just 2 different varieties. One was the variety without any assay or mint mark, because the whole series here is no mint mark, remember. And then the other variety does have an assayer here below the denomination too. Unfortunately, we can't see what's on the other side on any of the examples known, so this could actually belong to a later type, but we also don't have any with dates. We just assume that it's part of this same series. So now we go to Series 5, the second to last series. This is Philip V proper, we'll say, when they brought a mint mark back. And the reason the mint mark came back is because in 1717, Nuevo Reino, Bogota, became its own viceroyalty. And that was when they went to calling it Santa Fe instead of Nuevo Reino. The mint was Santa Fe de Bogota. However, we only see that on the coins in 1722 and forward. They didn't do it in 1717. It was in 1722. So on these coins, you will see the mint mark as F, not SF for Santa Fe, but just F for Fe. And then the assayer on the other side. This coin, in fact, that I show here, I didn't even know about, and it's not known in Restrepo until very recently, and it very clearly shows the mint mark F there and the assayer A here. Date is not visible, but it's from this series, so we know it has to be 1722 or later. Also in this series, you will see the next assayer, S, is very prolific. You'll see a lot of dates, and then you see some differences in 1729. The crosses become thicker, the treasure dimples, the ringlets are just halves or 3/4 instead of full ringlets, and then you get into assayer M with a lot more dates, and a new assayer S after that. So there are quite a lot of different varieties or different types within this series. You also have Louis I, the Louis I issues of brief King Louis I, dated 1724 and 25 within this series. And then finally, this series is also the one that has the very first 8 escudos and 4 escudos to be struck at this mint, starting in the early 1740s. I think that I don't want to get into too much detail besides what you see on the screen here, but the main point between Type A and Type B is that Type B has the king's name as Ludovicus for Louis I. Notice, by the way, that it's spelled LVDVVICVS, which is unique to this mint. Mexico said Ludovicus, and Potosí used sometimes Luis and sometimes Ludovicus, but for whatever reason, Bogotá was the only mint that used double V for Ludovicus. It was misspelling, which was not unusual for this mint. Also notice lions and castles transposed, not too unusual, but you have to observe, again, the entire elements of the coin to recognize that this is not a Charles II, posthumous, or anything like that. We're into the proper period of Philip V and Louis I in the early 1700s, 1720s. These are more types of the same, but notice the differences that you have assayer S for the first two, type C and type D. You've got the range of dates in the late 1720s, a lot of overdates, and by the way, they typically all have just three-digit dates, 729, for example. They didn't have the first digit of the date. We see some one escudos here that have what I call three-quarter dimple rings. You see, these are not full circles, they're full rings, they are three-quarter sized. And they have little X's instead of what we call scissors. These fleur-de-lis here just look like a pair of scissors. Now, starting in 1729, we get to coins that have what I call half ringlets. I probably could have come up with a better example, but this one has a clear date of 1730 to show you. But you see here, the ringlets are only half size. They're not full rings like you see here on the left. So this is of this 1730 to 32 period. And then the next change for type E on the bottom here is an assayer M. Sometimes, usually, in fact, in the early years, the M is reading vertically like we see here. It looks like a number 3, but that is a vertical M. And this began in 1732, and quite a long range of dates there, and a lot of different varieties. Notice the half ringlets and a very thick cross. This is also the beginning of 4 escudos, which I don't show here, and the first 8 escudos, but I am showing you here a 1 escudo. It's a very typical 1 escudo from this period. Notice just the incomplete ringlets there. In fact, these are, I'll tell you what these are called in the next slide. And then just simple plus signs for what should be fleur-de-lis. On this slide, I want to show you what the 4s and the 8s look like. This is the next type after assayer M, which is now assayer S. And again, we have a thicker cross, an even thicker cross, and the ringlets have turned into just what I will call just semicircles or something like that. But on the right here is an example of our 4 escudos, and whereas the 2 escudos just shows an F, oops, I keep doing that. The 2 escudos just shows an F for Santa Fe and an S for the assayer. On the button is right in the same place. On the 4 escudos, you have a denomination 4 above the assayer letter. And then on the 8 escudos, a similar thing. You have the denomination 8 over F mint mark. And on the other side, this is the S. And right above it is a little tiny E, which can only mean escudos. So now we have Series 6, the final series, which went from 1746 to 1756. The only change from the previous series to this one is a change from the king, from Philip V to Ferdinand VI. And then, along with that change came a change in the mint mark, and this is why it's a different series. The mint mark is now FS instead of just F. And it's on one side of the shield or the other. It's not very consistent. And the assayer is either S or SR, 2-letter assayer for Sebastián de Ribera, the assayer. Other general evolutionary markers include the types of ribbons, the flows and the quadrants of the cross, which change from just 2 splits to 4, 2 split into 4, and then they become 4 distinct feet. which I'll show you here. Now, the problem is that, again, there are so few dates that I'm unable to break it into different varieties, but also now we have 4 different denominations, and it's not useful to think of the varieties for for all denominations together. So instead, I've broke it down into the individual denominations. The 1 escudos, you have the first variety that has, and this is the one that I'm showing here. These are unique darts. You notice there are no rings or half circles. All we have here are what I call darts in the dimples of the cross. Here's the the mint mark F. Presumably below that is an S, FS. And then on the other side would be the assayer S. There are 2 other varieties for the 1 escudo as well. Now on the 2 escudos, notice we have no treasure loops at all, or ringlets or anything. In fact, the fleur-de-lis, they're supposed to be fleur-de-lis, they look more like scissors, have actually jumped out of the cross now and are outside of the treasure. Very distinctive for this late period. Again, we have FS for the mint mark. Over here, very clearly, we have an R. So this is one of the kind of rare examples with assayer SR for Sebastián de Rivera. It also occurs with RS instead of SR. But more commonly, you will see just an S. And in the past, there's been some confusion as to whether that's just part of the mint mark, and you can see why. You have 2 S's, which one's the assayer, which one's the mint mark. But I will guarantee you that in this period, they have both letters for the mint mark FS somewhere on the coin. Now and you can see, I just want to point out very briefly the change in the ribbons. You have 2 legs here, they start to split here, very split here, and then when you get to the very latest coins, this is 1754, you can see they look like jellyfish or squid. They have 4 distinct legs. That will tell you the time frame. So now I'll get into the 4 escudos and the 8 escudos. I identified 3 different varieties in the 4 escudos, as you can see here, with different dates. Not a lot of differences from the 2 escudos. Again, you can see that by the time you get to the very latest dates, you have a 4-legged monster instead of fleur-de-lis. And the 8 escudos, they get a little more complex. There was a lot more variation in the 8 escudos, presumably because they ran through a lot more dies. Kent Ponteria did an excellent study on these. I really have very little changes to make on that. But one thing I want to point out that's very interesting within the known varieties of the 8 escudos is that if you see one with the lions facing the wrong way, which you do see on the quarter realis too, by the way, that is only for 1751 with proper lions and castles. In other words, if you see the lions and castles in their proper quadrants and the lion is facing to the right instead of left, that's 1751. I've not seen any other dates associated with that. Again, we can see you start out with somewhat normal 2 ribbon fleurs, and by the time we get to the latest dates, it's the bug-eyed monster with 4 legs. So I believe that's it. I've got a brief bibliography for you here. My hope is that all these details that I've given you will help you better understand these coins, and hopefully catalogers will be able to do a better job, and NGC can put things in slabs properly with this information. But I do want to recognize, again, the various sources and auction houses from which I've gotten these photos, and of course, I thank again the organizers of this for letting me present this. So, muchas gracias.
It's not a question, it's a compliment.
Oh.
It's pretty astounding, the work that you put into this. I can't imagine the hours that went into it, the resources. I hope there's a book forthcoming.
Well, eventually, yes.
Sobra decir que tu padre fue miembro de Numismáticos colombianos, sí, y es un orgullo para nosotros hoy tener el hijo acompañándonos. Y pido un aplauso para él y para el padre, en la memoria del padre, que realmente fue de los precursores del estudio de la